She was poor. The widow mentioned in our gospel, putting the coins into the treasury, she was poor. As was the widow we heard of in our first reading, at the time of the prophet Elijah. She too was poor. Invariably in the Bible, widows are listed among the poor, and hardly surprising, for in a time when there was no social security, they were dependent upon the charity of others in order to exist. And of course, like all the poor, they're at the margins of society, the first to suffer when things go wrong. That was true in biblical times. It's true also today for the poor of today. They are the first to suffer, and they are the ones who suffer most. Whether it's the economic crisis we had in 2008, whether it's the pandemic we've faced over the past 2 years, or whether it's the ongoing climate crisis, environmental crisis that we face just now, the poor are the first to suffer. And when it comes to the environment, it's not just individual people, but also societies, countries. It's the poor countries, the countries with low income, where the people live more in harmony with nature than we do, where the people who have not caused the pollution suffer from our pollution. They suffer from our industrial revolution. They suffer from our addiction to the consumption of fossil fuels. So the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor for justice mingle together as one cry. It should not be that way, of course. If you go to the Gospel of John, John's Gospel starts by saying, "In the beginning was the Word." And then a few verses later it says, "It is through the Word that all things were made." St. John in the Gospel refers back to the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible. And it's there we hear God speak the Word. And God says, "Let there be." And all creation comes into being. And we are told that God looks at creation and sees all that was made, and indeed, it was very good. Today, though, as we look around at God's creation, we have to hold our heads in shame because we see a creation that has been deteriorated, damaged, indeed destroyed by human activity. We step outside our buildings and we breathe in the polluted air. We see plastic floating on our rivers and seas and oceans. And we know of the great exploitation of the world's resources, which are often dug up without a concern for the indigenous peoples who live there, or without a care for preserving the biodiversity of nature, and without a thought of future generations and what we're going to leave to them. We have heard the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. That's why COP26 is taking place in Glasgow. And here we will hear many words spoken, many human words spoken. In the Bible, when God speaks, God's word and God's action go together. So God's word effects what it sets out to do. But that's not the case with human words. Human words and human actions are separate And we hear many fine human words about the environment. But we still hope and await the actions that will accompany those words and actually make a difference. Here we see a common problem faced by the environmental movement and also faced by religion. If we take religion as an example, Christianity, since we're all here, many people admire the teachings of Jesus. I will even say, if only everyone lived according to those teachings, how much better the world would be. But we don't live according to those teachings, because the teachings of Jesus are a call to conversion, a call to a complete change of life. And so while many can admire his words, they don't have the courage to pursue the actions necessary to put those teachings into practice. And we see the same with the environmental movement. We're all environmentalists now. We all say fine things, we all say the right things, we all express concern for the environment. But where are the actions that put those words into practice? Even companies which pollute the earth try and paint themselves greener than green. And many people hope, and indeed expect, that technology will solve all our problems, so we can continue to live our current lifestyle as we always have done, without making any deep or profound changes. Without recognizing this is our current Western lifestyle which is the cause of the problem. And those problems go deep. When was the last time you heard yourself called a citizen? More often we find ourselves referred to as consumers. What an insult to be called a consumer, as though our whole purpose in life and in society was to consume, because the more we consume, the more we spend, the greater the economic growth, the higher the GDP, and how much better things are, at least according to an present economic model. And that flawed model is a cause of our environmental crisis, because it's based on consumption, without recognizing that the Earth's resources are limited and finite, and without recognizing that those resources are there to be shared by all, and not just used by the powerful and rich. We have come to this church today motivated by our faith, because we recognize that our faith urges us to do something about this environmental crisis. But it's true to say that in the wider church, not everyone is agreed, or they see that this is a religious issue. In fact, there are even those who would think that Pope Francis should have better things to do with his time rather than write an encyclical called Laudato Si. They fail to realize that we're not talking here about the climate, we're talking about creation. And we're told in the book of Genesis that God says to Adam and Eve, care for the earth. We have been commissioned by God to be stewards of creation, guardians of creation. So our relationship with God is very much tied up with the world that God has created and our place in that world. In the beginning, God spoke the word. And it was a creative word, because God's word and action or combined. Now, in our day, may we too speak creative words as our words and actions combine together, as we hear and respond to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor.